Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you here, and thank you for joining us. I will say that this hybrid event is being recorded, okay? So choose your words wisely. We have quite a good number of people joining us online. I hope you can hear us, as well as people here in the room. So my name is Anita. I'm a senior lecturer here at Queen Mary. I'm also the director of the Childhood Law and Policy Network, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event. And we're delighted to have with us today Anita and Francesca, and I'll say a bit more about each of them. But our event today is dedicated to Anita's latest book, which is called Suffer the Little Children, Child Migration and the Geopolitics of Compassion in the United States. And the book is the first comprehensive historical analysis of unaccompanied child migration to the United States over the past century. And Anita will discuss the book's key arguments, and we'll have an opportunity to take questions and answers. In addition to CLPN, the Childhood Law and Policy Network, we're also very generously co-sponsored by the OrderS Center for the Legal Study of Borders and Migration, which is also based here in the department. And the founding director, is joining us remotely from San Francisco, where it's much earlier now. And she'll say a few words, Violeta Moreno-Lax. So thank you very much, Violeta, for your support of this event. I'll say a few words about each of our speakers. Anita Casavantes Bradford is a professor of history and Chicano Latino studies at the University of California Irvine. She's also currently the associate dean of the School of Social Sciences there. Anita is a scholar of immigration, race and ethnicity, foreign relations, critical refugee studies, and childhood. So quite a lot. Before her latest book, which we're discussing today, she also published another book titled The Revolution is for Children, The Politics of Childhood in Havana and Miami, 1959 to 1962. And alongside her academic career, Anita has been involved in migrants' rights activism, diversity education, and advocacy for first-generation university students like herself. Which I was just saying earlier, we have a lot of those here at Queen Mary. And Francesca, I managed to. Francesca Meloni is lecturer in social justice at King's College London. Her research focuses on contemporary processes of migration and social exclusion. She's interested in the interface between migration, policy, race, and age, and also in the impact of legal status on the experiences of belonging and access to social services. Francesca has a background in anthropology and over 15 years of experience conducting ethnographic research in migration contexts in the UK, Canada, and Italy. Last year, her book came out, titled Ways of Belonging, Undocumented Youth in the Shadow of Illegality, which examines the experiences of undocumented youths in Canada and the ways in which they're rendered invisible in the education system, So we couldn't have better speakers today, really. And our format today is as follows. Anita will discuss her book for roughly 30 minutes. We won't be too strict on time. And then Francesca will respond for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have an opportunity to take questions and comments, both here from the room and online. Before we start, let me hand the mic over to my colleague, Violeta.
Thank you very much, Hedy. I mean, this is just briefly to say hello to everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us both in person in London and online. As it has already been said, I am Violeta Moreno-Lax. I'm a professor of law here at Queen Mary and the director of the Borders Center for the Legal Study of Borders, Migration and Displacement that is co-hosting this event alongside the Childhood Law and Policy Network. We're very happy for this collaboration, and we hope that there are going to be further opportunities to bring this cooperation on. Before passing the floor again to Hedy and the colleagues in the room, let me just say a few words about the center, which is a relatively new venture. It was founded in 2022 to focus on the study of bordering, ordering, and othering processes facilitated or mediated through law. So the center constitutes or aspires to constitute an excellence hub for intellectual collaboration and the evaluation of the role of law in the making and unmaking of borders and their impact on global mobility. The idea is to connect scholars within and beyond Queen Mary Law School to harness existing inter- and multidisciplinary research into law, borders, and mobility, and in this way to shape future policy and research agendas in response to global challenges. So within this framework, I'm very pleased to welcome the author of the book that we're going to be discussing today, Professor Anita Casavantes, and her discussant, Dr. Francesca Meloni, who will be commenting, as it's already been said, on Anita's book, Suffer the Little Children, Child Migration and the Geopolitics of Compassion in the United States. We're looking forward to the discussion. Thank you all very much. And I now pass the floor to Hedy. For those who are following online, please, if you have questions, type them on the chat, and this is going to be moderated as the speakers come to a close in their interventions. Thank you very much, and now the floor is back to the room.
Thank you so much, Violeta, and I'm handing the floor now to Anita.
All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. I want to start by thanking Hedy Viterbo and the Childhood Law and Policy Network, of which I am an enthusiastic member, for inviting me to give this talk today, and also to Dr. Violeta Moreno and to Dr. Nicolette Busatil, who I know is online, and to Ellen for coming to fetch me, and of course, Dr. Francesca Meloni for the commentary that she'll provide on our book. For the scholars in the room, you know that it's always an honor when someone reads what you've published. We're never quite convinced that anyone reads our work. And so when they do, it's a gift and it's much appreciated. So it's my honor to be with you today. So because it would be impossible to discuss everything that is covered in a book in a short lecture, I've decided to focus this lecture on one of Suffer the Little Children's many intertwined analytical threads, the question of what I call the racialized politics of deterrence. And although I approach this topic from a historical and from a US-focused lens, I hope that it will nonetheless be of broad interest and that it may in some ways resonate with British experiences of unaccompanied child migration, both past and present. And so with that in mind, I'll proceed as follows. I'll give a brief overview of the book's big questions and central arguments, and then I'll share some thoughts on the racialized politics of deterrence that I argue underlies US law and policy towards unaccompanied migrant children. And then I'll conclude with a few thoughts on what perhaps a more equitable approach to the prolonged immigration and refugee crisis facing the United States might look like moving forward. In 2015, more than 50,000 Central American minors undertook solo journeys north in the hopes of starting new lives in the United States. Seeking safety, freedom, and opportunity, most of them were apprehended, incarcerated, and summarily deported. Protesting the children's lack of legal representation and their detention in prison-like facilities designed for adults, lawmakers, lobbyists, and children's advocates asserted that the United States should treat Central American boys and girls as refugees from violence and economic deprivation that have a unique age-based claim on asylum. Opponents argued that the children represented an invasion of young deviants and criminals drawn to the US by an overly generous immigration policy, epitomized by President Obama's 2012 DACA executive order, which granted temporary residence permits and work authorization to undocumented youth. And just as an update, the DACA program stopped receiving new applications in 2020 after a Texas federal court injunction. And so although it remains on the books, it has effectively ceased to exist. Sadly, almost 10 years after I began research on this topic, the crisis of unaccompanied child migration to the US continues. And the struggle to determine the parameters of unaccompanied children's rights under US law has only intensified since President Joseph Biden took office in January 2021, as a new surge of unaccompanied Central American minors continued arriving at the border seeking asylum. However, this controversy over the United States' legal and moral obligation to this most vulnerable migrant population fails to recognize that this recent phenomenon of unaccompanied child migration to the US, although unique in intensity, is not in fact unprecedented. Historians have no way of estimating how many thousands or tens of thousands of unaccompanied children have migrated to the US throughout the nation's history. Their numbers are unknown for many reasons. Because of the paucity of immigration record keeping before the 20th century, because many have entered without official inspection, and also because of shifting definitions of who counts as a child at different moments in time. It's nonetheless true that children entering the United States without a parent or a responsible guardian, whether bonded or free, voluntarily or coerced, have been a large, albeit largely invisible, immigrant population since the colonial era. Kidnapped African children, legally classified in the US as imported property rather than as immigrants, represent the most vivid example of the erasure of unaccompanied child migrants from US history. Traces of their existence nonetheless do appear in scholarly literature and archives. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I've put a couple of citations on the slide. Maybe you can take a screenshot of it. However, while unaccompanied child migration is not new, it wasn't until the eve of World War II that Americans began to develop an understanding of unaccompanied child migrants as a distinct immigrant population, along with a growing, if selective, concern for young people migrating alone. And so it is during this interwar period when my book, Suffer the Little Children, begins. Suffer the Little Children, as Hedy noted, is the first comprehensive historical analysis of unaccompanied child migration to the US from the 1930s through the present day. Based on 5 years of multi-sided archival research and incorporating theoretical insights from scholars of political science, sociology, critical legal, and critical refugee studies, it asks the following questions. In what ways have shifting international and domestic circumstances shaped how, when, and why specific groups of children gained admission and protection in the United States? How have the laws, policies, and programs devised to admit and care for those children evolved? What key players have shaped the nation's response to the phenomenon of unaccompanied child migration? And how have the objectives, beliefs, and strategies of those players changed over time? And finally, how have emerging notions of refugees and children's rights interacted with American understandings of race, class, and religion, as well as national origin, gender, and age, to influence which children were granted or denied sanctuary? In answering these questions, Suffer the Little Children argues that from the 1930s through 2020, an extraordinarily wide range of organizations and actors, motivated by an equally diverse range of values, beliefs, and interests, played important roles in shaping the US's response to unaccompanied child migration. Evolving from a series of ad hoc, voluntary, and often religiously based, agency-directed child-saving schemes that targeted specific groups of endangered foreign children, over time into a more broadly conceived set of federal laws, policies, and programs regulating the treatment of both unaccompanied refugee minors, otherwise known as URMs in American legal shorthand, as well as unauthorized alien children, or UACs. This process of historical change was linked to both the expansion of the US federal government after World War II and to the emergence by the 1970s and 80s of an international consensus about refugee and children's rights. However, notwithstanding official and media discourses that consistently insisted on the altruistic or humanitarian motives underlying successive policies and programs, I argue in Suffer the Little Children that the US's response to unaccompanied child migrants has been historically and continues to be driven by a geopolitics of compassion that selectively highlights United States benevolence towards suffering people outside the nation's borders, while simultaneously prioritizing foreign policy and domestic political objectives over asylum seekers' best interests. Organized chronologically, Suffer the Little Children's chapters each tell the story of a specific child evacuation or resettlement effort from its origins through its aftermath. In chapter 1, I tell a story of the small German Jewish Children's Aid, an organization that fought against all odds to bring only a few hundred endangered Jewish children to the United States during the period of Nazi terror leading up to the outbreak of World War II. Chapter 2 focuses on the efforts of the interfaith activism behind the failed campaign to bring 20,000 endangered Jewish children to the US through the 1939 Wagner-Rogers Bill, which unfortunately stalled in Congress. The chapter also takes up how this same interfaith coalition then rebranded itself as the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, otherwise known as USCOM, in 1940, in order to begin coordinating the spontaneous grassroots efforts that had popped up across the US to bring English children to the US during the Battle of Britain. At the same time that USCOM also employed policies and programs that were developed to accommodate those English children to continue bringing a small number of European Jewish boys and girls to the US. Chapter 3 examines the intertwined history of efforts to resettle unaccompanied white European refugee minors in the US and the rise of intercountry adoption in the decade after World War II. Beginning in 1946, several US voluntary agencies collaborated to bring a small number of white European war orphans, many of whom were not in fact orphans, to the United States, but soon found themselves in competition with American proponents of private intercountry adoption, which many white American families saw as a way to grow their families while assisting war-afflicted white children and participating in the emerging struggle against communism. However, as I also note in this chapter, support for the resettlement of white European children. Oh, I wonder if there's someone on Zoom that might need to put their mute on. We're hearing you in the background. Just checking. Right, so this desire to adopt white European children did not include interest in taking in the so-called German brown babies, who were the literal offspring of the US military's discriminatory policy, which allowed white American service members to marry European women while denying Black American soldiers permission to marry of US protection.
Anita, could you repeat the last two sentences? I think you were muted.
Was I? Okay. Beginning
Sorry.
from the discussion of the brown babies? Okay.
Slightly late,
Okay, despite, okay, let's go with despite. Despite African-American efforts to secure admission for the often stigmatized and impoverished German brown babies, the US government's refusal to recognize any obligation towards the sons and daughters of American Black service members overseas, even as white European children were admitted as refugees and adoptees, revealed the racialized limits on which overseas children were imagined as deserving of US protection. In Chapter 4, I explore the US's response to the discovery of unattached youth amongst the 38,000 Hungarian escapees who were admitted to the US after the failed 1956 anti-Soviet uprising, which was the first US federal government-driven refugee resettlement program in US history. This unprecedented official involvement in resettling 800 Hungarian youth nonetheless represented a logical extension of emerging post-war notions of American responsibility towards endangered foreign children, still mostly white and mostly Christian, as well as of growing fears of communism as a threat to young people's ideological and spiritual formation. In Chapter 5, I analyze the origins and the evolution of the US's first federally funded and directed foster care program for unaccompanied refugee minors, which provided homes to more than half of the 14,000 unaccompanied minors who were sent from Cuba following Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959. Beginning as a temporary child evacuation scheme intended to demonstrate US support for Cuban parents involved in the anti-Castro underground, as well as to safeguard the ideological and spiritual purity of a few hundred of Cuba's elite, and again, mostly white, future leaders, the Cuban Children's Program quickly ballooned into a comprehensive child welfare program that struggled to improvise ways to care for a much longer period of time than was ever intended for thousands of increasingly poorer and darker-skinned unaccompanied Cuban minors, many of whom sought to enter the US as a first step to petitioning for visas for parents who were trapped on the island. In Chapter 6, I tell the story of the approximately 25,000 unaccompanied children amongst the more than 1 million Southeast Asian refugees admitted to the United States after the Vietnam War, a crisis which spurred the passage in 1980 of the US's first comprehensive refugee legislation, the 1980 Refugee Act, and created the nation's first permanently funded federal program for the admission and care of unaccompanied refugee minors. Oh, my slides are not forwarding. Let's see. Okay. In a short Chapter 7, I trace the evolution of the US response to unaccompanied child migration in recent decades. Despite the 1980 Refugee Act's humanitarian aspirations, I argue that the geopolitical and domestic political considerations that had driven refugee children's policy in the past have in fact continued to disproportionately shape decisions about which children are deemed worthy of admission and protection. To illustrate this claim, Chapter 7 contrasts the standard of care provided to a small but increasingly diverse group of unaccompanied refugee minors, the URMs of which I spoke, a population that after the mid-1990s included several hundred former African child soldiers, as well as a highly visible contingent of Sudanese lost boys, who received as URMs very different treatment from the harsh reception that was offered to the growing numbers of unauthorized Haitian, Mexican, and Central American children who sought security and opportunity in the United States beginning in the 1980s. With this overview complete, I'd like to share a few thoughts on how a racialized politics of deterrence has shaped the US treatment of unaccompanied minors. Suffer the Little Children makes an argument about how changing notions of race and difference, articulated in terms not just of skin color, but also ethnicity, religion, national origin, class, gender, and age, have all powerfully influenced which unaccompanied minors have been seen as deserving of protection and sympathy, and which have been reviled as anchors, or as deviants, or as criminals. I consider the extent to which different groups of unaccompanied child migrants since the 1930s have been understood as individual rights-bearing subjects, and the ways that notions of race in particular have influenced those understandings. Like women before them, children have long been considered possessions or appendages of adults. In fact, in the United States, they went unrecognized as individual subjects of immigration law until 1907, when children's admission without a parent or guardian was formally prohibited, although in practice, this fell to the discretion of immigration officers at points of entry. By the time the 1980 Refugee Act was passed, US immigration law contained a number of provisions that explicitly recognized minors' age-based needs and interests. However, as my book reveals, decisions about which unaccompanied children to admit or exclude continue even today to be based on an understanding of children as an extension of their parents and communities. This implicit denial of children's individual existence has facilitated the admission of some unaccompanied minors, mostly white, middle class, and/or Christian, when Americans wished to demonstrate solidarity or provide assistance to their parents or home nations, as they did to Great Britain in 1940, or to Hungarian anti-communists after the failed 1956 revolution, or to elite white Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans in 1960. But this understanding of children as extensions of their families and racial or ethnic communities has also worked against poor, non-white, and non-Christian children, whose claims on admission since the 1930s have been evaluated in light of their broader implications for refugee and immigrant flows from their homelands, instead of in terms of their individual need for protection. This has led to what I call in the book a racialized logic of deterrence that justified in 1930s barring most endangered Jewish children from the United States, seeing them as an entering wedge whose admission would lead to an influx of Jewish adult refugees. Since then, this logic has either implicitly or explicitly sought to deny racially undesirable unaccompanied minors the right to be considered for admission to the US based on their individual circumstances. It has also provided justification for policies that adjudicated non-white children's asylum claims in light of their relationship to their stigmatized families and communities, rather than on the basis of the children's best interest. This racialized logic reasserted itself after the US defeat in the Vietnam War, when as early as 1976, Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, officers tried to limit the admission to the US of unaccompanied Southeast Asian refugee minors that they saw as anchors. Acting at first in defiance of State Department guidance, These rogue INS officials were at the forefront of a growing anti-refugee coalition in the federal government after 1981. At the heart of their actions was a discourse that framed Vietnamese unaccompanied children, as they had Jewish children during the 1930s, as the entering wedge through which their adult relatives might flood the nation. With the passage of the 1980 Refugee Act, the US's first comprehensive refugee law and the first by which the US adopted a universal definition of refugees in line with the 1967 UN protocol, the US government also adopted its first comprehensive law recognizing child refugees as possessing an age-based right to admission. Despite this groundbreaking legislation, I argue in my book that a racialized logic of deterrence has continued to drive the US's treatment of unaccompanied child migrants, and especially those unregulated refugee seekers from south of the US border, which, I argue in my book, the 1980 Act failed to adequately account for. This glaring omission appeared within weeks of the 1980 Refugee Act's passage, when new waves of anti-Castro Cubans and Haitians fleeing the US-aligned Duvalier dictatorship sought asylum in the US. Among them were hundreds of a new kind of child migrant, unauthorized alien children, UACs, for whom the 1980 Act had also failed to account. Now, since the 1980 Act lacked statutory provisions for adjudicating the refugee claims of unaccompanied minors, their processing was left in the hands of frontline immigration and naturalization service officers who had not been trained on how to make age determinations or to assess children's protection needs. Institutional barriers to children's asylum were further exacerbated by frontline INS agents' occupational culture, which prioritized immigration enforcement and deterrence over the humanitarian considerations of refugees and asylum seekers. And in the absence of clear procedural guidelines or oversight, many INS agents, either knowingly or unknowingly, ignored federal guidance to treat children with sensitivity, adopting instead the adversarial approach that they used when dealing with unauthorized adult border crossers. This included failing to inform many children of their right to request asylum, or coercing them into accepting voluntary departure despite their experience or well-founded fear of persecution in their homelands. What's more, the INS agents' ideologically and racially charged perceptions of mixed-race Cubans as legitimate political refugees and Black Haitians as opportunistic economic migrants, ideas that were widely shared by white Americans and reinforced by US media, meant that the unauthorized solo child migrants who were parts of these influxes often received vastly different treatment. Between 1980 and the present day, the US has seen the emergence of a vastly inequitable two-tier system that provides annual admissions and federally funded foster care for a few hundred legally authorized unaccompanied refugee minors, or URMs, selected from overseas from areas designated as current high priority by the US State Department, while leaving the overwhelming majority of underage solo migrant children who arrive at the US border without previous authorization from Latin America and the Caribbean, almost entirely in the hands of an inadequately trained and almost exclusively deterrence-minded Border Patrol. In April 2017, the racialized logic of deterrence underlying this system reached new heights when, during the Trump administration, US Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a new zero-tolerance policy, instructing border agents and prosecutors to criminally process all unauthorized border crossers, including asylum seekers and families with small children. Now, to clarify the legal logic underlying this instruction, although unlawful entry to the country is a crime under US law, historically, it has rarely been charged. And when it has carried civil, not criminal penalties in the form of deportation or a ban on re-entry to the country for a certain period of time. The Trump administration's zero tolerance policy changed this, requiring all apprehended border crossers to be criminally charged and arrested before they were detained. Now, since US law allows for unauthorized alien children to be detained separately from criminal alien relatives or guardians, charging all adult unauthorized migrants with a criminal violation provided the legal justification for the Attorney General to order Border Patrol agents to separate migrant children from their parents. Within weeks, as many as 3,000 children, most under the age of 10, were taken away from their mothers and fathers, often through deception or force. Now, lest anyone be confused about the racialized logic of deterrence that inspired the zero tolerance policy, then US Department of Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly made clear that the policy was intended to discourage more Central American adults from seeking asylum in the US. Now, while horrific, as I point out in some of my other work, this is not the first time that the US government has separated children, and especially children of color, from their Black, Native American, or Asian parents. Nor is it the first time that it has used those children as a tool to coerce or to deter certain behaviors from adults within or without US borders. Rather, this was the latest application of the racialized logic of deterrence that was first deployed to prevent Jewish children fleeing Nazi terror from finding shelter in the US. Whether demonized as juvenile delinquents, gangbangers, or anchors, migrant youth from south of the US border, like Jewish and Southeast Asian children before them, continue to be framed as a threat to the United States' political, economic, and cultural integrity by those who oppose their admission. This racial logic of deterrence once barred the US's doors to hundreds of thousands of children who later perished in the Holocaust. Today, it is at the heart of the legal violence perpetuated against tens of thousands of Latin American and Caribbean minors seeking asylum in the US. It is fundamental to an American geopolitics of compassion that continues to value foreign policy and domestic political objectives above the welfare of endangered foreign children. Suffer the Little Children makes clear that the United States federal government needs to adopt a more consistent and more humane approach to the ongoing problem of unaccompanied child migration. But how? I argue that they could begin by faithfully implementing laws and policies already on the books, which detail the rights of all children in US custody to be treated with basic dignity and care. But that won't be enough. Broader reform will also be necessary, beginning with legislation to address two pressing deficiencies in current US immigration law. First, despite the chaos surrounding the 1980 Mariel boat lift and the Haitian migrant crisis, which revealed in the same year of its passage the deficiencies of the 1980 Refugee Act, the US still lacks an effective legal and logistical infrastructure for serving as a nation of mass first asylum, an understanding of the nation that many American leaders still refuse to accept, despite more than 40 years of history as serving as the nation of first asylum for people fleeing from south of the border. Second, the US has shamefully yet to codify the internationally accepted principle of children's best interests within its immigration law. Because children who cross borders alone are in fact both individuals and members of their communities, both of these omissions must be addressed. And I will stop there. Yes, because it appears that I have talked too much. And so I would like to just end by saying that because I am a US historian, I hesitate to draw any comparisons with the situation of child migration to the UK. But I look forward to hearing from my colleagues and from those of you who have lived here for a while about your impressions about where our immigration systems and the way that they treat unaccompanied children may overlap or diverge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe we can touch on some other points in the discussion. And just to say preliminarily, there do seem to be many parallels, even though obviously each country has its own specificities, many parallels when we're talking about the racialized logic or politics of the parents. So maybe we can explore some of those.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anita. And thanks to OD. It was really wonderful to read the book. It was really an engaging read, so I really enjoyed it. But I would like just to briefly talk about some of the things that stood out for me, but also I would like to, to start with the backstory that you give in the book at page 1. And I really appreciate it because sometimes, the reason why we write academic books, is left unspoken. And this really tells something about, how you were involved and also about the topic in a quite personal way. And so, you start on the background with the context of the hostile reception of Central American young people in the US. And you write, as the controversy raged, students from what was then the University of California in Irvine's undocumented student organization, DREAMS at UCI, asked me to help them make sense of the hostile reception experienced by this group of vulnerable children from a region where many of them had family ties on their own. As DREAMS at UCI's faculty advisor and as an historian of immigration and childhood, I felt a keen obligation to provide real answers to their questions. This book represents my best attempt at fulfilling this obligation. So yeah, I'd like just to sink in, but I think, it's a testament of, how you make explicit how you're part of larger and broader communities that we are all part of. And we are part of communities in higher education institutions and with students. I was also thinking about, this year, how, that role also became crucial, right? And how students wanted to create those spaces to, for instance, discuss together why there is this differential treatment of young people and children as things are happening, right? So for instance, in Palestine and why they're treated differently from Ukraine, et cetera. And I think it's really fundamental to create and open up some of these spaces. So yeah, thank you for that. And maybe we can also discuss more at the end. But I think, one of the things that really stood out for me is how you, in a sense, easily draw on so many different, case study, and you pick different case study to eloquently show some of this differential treatment and racialized treatment of young people throughout history. And you really take us on an historical journal to understand some of these hostile and ambivalent attitudes towards child migrants and where do they come from. And so I would like just to talk a little bit more about, this historical focus and why I think, this historical focus is also quite, quite new. There aren't, I think, so many books on unaccompanied minors that really have that perspective. And why it is important and why it was such a refreshing perspective for me. And in that you know, in that historical focus, I think you put the question of, I think, you know, the question of asylum and migration in context, and also the ambiguous treatment of childhood and what really counts as a child and who is responsible for the protection of the child, really starting from geopolitical links as a point of departure. And there were so many connections, I think, yeah, with the UK or present times that, you know, we can see at play. And I think lots of the research that is done on migration and unaccompanied asylum seekers and child refugees as a very social and public policy focus, you know, and I'm also include myself into you know, into doing research with that focus, but it's a research that is very much empirically engaged and very much driven by these questions of, you know, what about now? What do we need to do? You know, and also like sometimes policy driven, right? So some of the questions are really dominated by sometimes also the urgency of the now, and sometimes also some of the, you know, political appeal and humanitarian appeal of you know, the lack of protection for these children, as you started with the lack of protection of Central American young people. And I think this is a problem of also, like, yeah, lots of refugees and migration studies that have been criticized for being quite ahistorical. And I think things are quite shifting. And I think, like, you know, to have an historical focus is really, really important, you know, also for people doing empirical research, for questioning, you know, where do these things emerge, really? And I think there are some assumptions that they are frequently done in, you know, scholarly literature, but also, like, you know, in activist discourses, et cetera, you know, when we talk, for instance, about hostile policies, it seems that, you know, they're just new, or there is like a discourse that says that, you know, they emerged especially in the 80s and in the 90s in the West. So, you know, that there is a discourse of bogus refugees that they started at that time. And because there was an increase in the number of refugees in Western countries, and also a tendency to see the diversion from the 1951 Refugee Convention as, you know, the problem of the lack of protection in Western countries. And so I think your book helped us to show some of these differential treatment and some of the, I guess, the absences and the silences, right? Of and, you know, you talk, for instance, like, you know, about these silent histories of enslaved children, and you know, we can also talk, you know, there is a lot of, I think, of literature that is emerging, complementing some of these dots and highlighting some of these silences. And you know, it's a history that points to basically, like, you know, the darker sides of the asylum law, starting, for instance, like, you know, from Hannah Arendt, who told us that, you know, the problem of refugees has been created with the nation states, right? And the creation of the nation states that make these boundaries between citizens and minorities. But there is also like a new literature on, you know, tracing the links between colonialism and asylum. So, for instance, like, yeah, in the UK, but also like internationally. And for instance, how this, you know, all this emergence of the asylum law puts like a silence on racialized minorities or refugees also coming from former colonies, right? That weren't considered refugees. And so I think, yeah, you really help us to see how these ideas of, yeah, what you call like this differential humanity, right, was developed through time. And it seems that, you know, as you show us, this differential humanities was, first of all, treated on the boundary of race, right? If we unpick and dig all these histories, right, and trace all these parallels, like then race and racializations really come to the fore as something important that constructs humanity. And so non-European and non-white asylum seekers then are considered and have been considered undesirable and also assumed to be more difficult to integrate, right? Integrate into mainstream society. And these concerns were part of the history and part of the policy from the beginning. And I think there is, like, with that, like that fundamental question of responsibility, right? Like, who is responsible for the displacement of these people? And there is clearly also lack of responsibility from the host state and from, you know, the US in regards to some of these children, that they are racialized. I think, you know, throughout the book and in all the case studies, there is really that question that is hunting, you know, policymakers is hunting, like, you know, like civil societies and all these contradictory instances of, you know, different organizations, interfaith organizations that you unpick so beautifully, right, in what is sometimes taken for granted as the state. But, you know, like it's all these different voices and all these different part of society that push, right, at different parts. And it's really like, you know, when is it that this child becomes a problem, right? There is this haunting shadow of the problem child. And you know, sometimes this child is considered too young, sometimes too old. It's a boy and not a girl, so like, you know, difficult and criminal, is non-white, like religion is a problem, is an anchor, will bring some parents. So, you know, all it's every time, like there is that question of, you know, anticipating how it can be a problem in society. And I think another thing that struck me that also I would like to just emphasize, and then I can conclude here, because also it resonates, I think, with lots of the present times, is like the question of temporality. Because I think lots of times, lots of the programs of resettlement that you show throughout history have that element of temporality, right? So they are created, but the young people, the children are accepted, like with restrictions, like, you know, with quotas and visas, and because of that, and, you know, age limits, etc., but on a temporary basis, right? So they are guests in that society, and sometimes often they have limited access to welfare services, to citizenship. Sometimes, you know, you show that in the US society or the organization didn't even think that these children, for instance, you know, could be traumatized or could need some special support or special services. So there is really that angle of temporality and precariousness. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, when they are accepted as permanent citizens, they are accepted because they are completely denied their identity. So they are denied family attachment. Sometimes they are treated as orphans. And so there is this vicious and callous, you know, almost like extortion of you know, like family granting the you know, permission to adopt, to send a child abroad or to give the child for adoption. And so and made me also think that, you know, it has also like this kind of long history of you know, for instance, like children coming from impoverished background, coming from you know, First Native nations or indigenous groups, that they are completely derooted from their cultural, religious identity, from their family ties, from their language, and then taken, somewhere and integrated in their society, but really like molded into that kind of citizen. So yeah, would like to stop here. But yeah, thank you so much for writing a wonderful book, and for I think it's really an important contribution, and it can make us think about so many things. And there are also so many parallels, I think, with the UK. It resonates at so many levels, and I think we can maybe discuss about that.
It's almost an ungrateful ask to expect people to convey such a rich piece of rich historical analysis within the time you have. And I think you did an excellent job at really highlighting some of the key issues which we can explore, because luckily we do have a good amount of time left. Maybe I can kick us off by just highlighting some additional themes, and maybe talking more explicitly, because we are based in the UK, about some parallels. I think one parallel is empire. We were talking about colonialism. We know, obviously, that the US has a long record of meddling in Latin American politics, and then you see waves of migration from some of those same countries. So obviously there are questions of historical accountability. The same obviously could be said about the former British Empire and some of its former colonies, where we have waves of migration coming from those territories. So that's one very evident parallel. The other is the racialized politics of deterrence. We often hear from the UK government, when they're asked to invest more resources into processing asylum applications, they divert the discussion into saying, no, but we invest foreign aid into the countries, the countries of origin, so they don't have to migrate in the first place. That distracts and using humanitarianism to avert responsibility for these people who are already here. And another parallel, the last one, is in terms of the racialized composition, which you alluded to, of refugees in this country. People are aware of that, but just to speak specifically of the numbers, according to the latest numbers that we have from the Home Office, 60% of refugees coming here in the last year have been from Ukraine. 25% have been from Hong Kong, and that's because these two countries have special schemes with the government which make them legal migrants, unlike unlawful aliens. So 15% is all the other countries in the world, right? Syria, Palestine, Sudan, essentially Asia and Africa. We don't get many from Venezuela here, but that does give a sense of the racialized composition of refugees and migrants here. One other thing, just to kind of expand the conversation beyond the US context a bit, childhood as a modern historical invention has always been racialized, okay? Well beyond the migration context. So but bringing this back into migration, for example, we know that many asylum seekers don't have proof of their age, or their ages are disputed. So the migration officers have to assess how old they are. We know that often, depending on the assessment method, there is a racialized element to it in terms of how old the person looks. Do they look like an adult, or do they look like a child? And often the officers do that in a racialized way. We even have studies in the US showing, in a different context, in the context of youth justice, that when you ask juries or judges to assess the age of what they call a juvenile delinquent, statistically speaking, they will assess the age of Black juvenile delinquents as being older than their same age white counterparts. So the physical appearance of childhood is racialized. So that's important that's part of, essentially what I'm trying to do is broaden the scope of our discussion now, both globally and in relation to childhood beyond the migration context. So I'll stop there. Maybe what we can do is pick up 2 questions from the chat and then 1 question from the room, and we can answer all 3 of them collectively. Do you want to ask 2?
Have any questions in the chat? Yeah.
No.
None yet.
Okay. Any questions from? Yeah.
Thank you, Anita, for like inspiring early career scholars. I listened to you as someone who's also writing the first book. I'm really inspired, and so thank you. I listened to your content, but also to how eloquently you delivered it. And so I wish I'm half as articulate as you. So I have two questions. Answer whichever you want to answer. So the first one is related to the concept of disturbingness and child migration, because I think you have tackled it in your like chapter 7, but your work resonated with the chapter that I wrote for the book Kids in Cages. It will be released. Sorry for this shameless plug. So it will be released in November 2024, and we edited by Emily Navarro and Anita Casavantes. Maybe you're familiar with that. Yeah. So yeah, I'm a University of Arizona Press, so watch out. So I analyzed there the paperworks of the ORR, the Office of the Refugee Resettlement, and it kind of resonated with how you also mentioned the personalized and a historical view of children as just geopolitical subjects. And then recently I did the same study with child refugees in Malaysia, and this is Asian context, but it also has some resonance when it comes to being a historical geopolitical subject. So thank you for that. So there's really parallel. So I get it. Yeah. So there's benevolence, but with a catch, like in that, you know. And then as I was reviewing the proofs of like this chapter, you know, when we are reviewing proofs, we kind of think, all right, this is not birth publishing, blah blah blah. So and then because I thought of disturbingness as a more like I think valid lens to analyze like child migration. And so I'd probably ask about the extent of like disturbingness that surfaces in your analysis, if that makes sense, probably in your chapter 7. And the second one is that so you're writing a book takes a while. And so again, as I'm also like writing my book, it's going to be released in 2026. And my point is that it takes a lot of time. Many will change, like policies maybe, and like paperworks, for example, even statistics. And if you can just walk us through the process of how you navigated like the changes, because you have to go back to your introduction once you finish the draft, and then I needed to like update all the things that I had written. So yeah, I mean, you don't have to answer both, just
And then if you can, when you answer questions, just very briefly kind of recapture the question for the benefit of people online if they didn't hear the full question.
Sure.
Do you want to pick another question, or do you want to start with those? Do we have any questions?
We have
online?
one more.
One. Okay, so let's start.
We have two more online. One that wants to speak. Do you mind just introducing yourself as well?
So hello, yeah, I am Irene. I am like from Macquarie University in Sydney, but I'm a visiting fellow right now at Newcastle University. I'm from geography, by the way.
And then we have a question from Gonda Van Steen. Did you want to unmute to ask?
Yes, please. I'm Rhonda Van Steen from King's College London, but not currently there. I was kind of, just as a comment, I feel we can't leave the American adoptive parents off the hook. They have such outspoken racial preferences. So as much as I see the INS workers do what they're doing, the preferences and the language in which the adoptive parents phrase them in the 1950s is hair-raising.
Yes.
I mean, questions like, along with a lot of ignorance, are Greek children Black? I mean, so I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on that.
Yes, and first of all, hello, Wanda, nice to see you. We corresponded while I was working on my book, and I found your scholarship on Greek children to be so important and so helpful. So thank you for your scholarship as well.
Maybe we can take the other question and then we can discuss all of that.
So there's a question about how might narratives around the human trafficking of children or young people tie into the historical analysis in the US. So many questions, and they're all such good questions. So I think, so I'll start with a quick answer to your second question, which is what do you do when you're writing about something and by the time you've published, things have changed, right? That's not as much an issue for me because I'm a historian. So, you know, the sort of substantive analysis of my book really stops. I mean, the in-depth chapters really end in the 80s. And then there's an epilogue that brings it from the 80s to 2010 in sort of a more broad brushstrokes. The introduction and the epilogue had to be touched up a little bit. And yeah, I mean, in those kind of cases, you just, you know, communicate with your press well in advance that before they actually go to make your proofs, that you want to look at your intro and your conclusion again to make sure that, you know, things are current. But I think this is more of a concern for people in social sciences than it is for me as a historian. The question of deservingness, yes, I mean, it's embedded in each of the chapters, right? The different humanitarian arguments that are made about children and you know, endangered children who deserve care, right? That argument is made in almost every case where children are admitted. But one of the things I argue in my book is that that argument gets made after the decisions have been made, right? Because children become visible to us after both the government and the media have pre-selected which groups of children we're going to worry about, right? So in the chapter that I'll speak about a bit to answer Gonda's question, in the post-World War II period, of course, the Chinese Civil War ended with the communist victory, and then there were, you know, more than 1 million Chinese refugees in Hong Kong, and there were displaced, unaccompanied children sleeping on the streets and starving in Hong Kong. The US media and, you know, child welfare agencies were not really concerned about those children, right? For a number of reasons, and some of them are simply to do with sort of anti-Asian sort of thinking in the US and in US immigration law, but they also go back to the way that refugees were defined by the United Nations in 1951. They were defined as being a product of the European war, right? So there were geographic and temporal and racial sort of logics that prevented the government and the media from seeing particular groups of children as being their concern, right? So that's really the argument that I make in my book, is that the geopolitics is sort of the first layer that children have to penetrate before they even become visible to the people who would then talk about their deservingness, right? It's not like the US government and the media sat down and did a critical assessment of displaced children throughout the world to analyze which is more deserving, right? It was already pre-filtered before those arguments were made, right? Yes, so that post-war period, in chapter 3 of my book, I talk about the war, it's called War Orphans and Babies on Demand. And the chapter is really about how two things happen at once in US kind of legal history around refugee children. There's a particular moment immediately after the war when the Displaced Persons Act was passed in the US, and then extensions to the Displaced Persons Act were passed, in which for a brief period of time, a legal category existed for the admittance of unaccompanied refugee children based on their own individual protection needs, right? But when the Displaced Persons Act was replaced in 1953 by the Refugee Relief Act, having seen that a number of children were being admitted as refugees based on their deservingness, objective deservingness, or their protection needs, that this had created a situation in which a legal precedent would quickly emerge that would commit the United States to admitting significant numbers of refugee children based on their protection needs, a very intricate dance happened in the US Congress, whereby white Americans who very much wanted to adopt white European children, but wanted to frame it as a humanitarian act, right? When in fact, what they were doing is growing their families at a time where there were no white children available for adoption in the United States, and they weren't interested in adopting Black children, right? What they wanted was access to European babies. Sort of an unholy alliance was created between these adoptive parents and conservative immigration restrictionists in Congress, who then in the 1953 Immigration Act rewrote the language that had allowed for the admission of refugee children as refugees and as like not adoptable children, right? But as refugees who could be placed with foster parents, but not adopted into US families and not have their ties to their natural families dissolved, rewrote that language in such a way that instead of allowing in refugee children, they were going to allow in war orphans and half orphans, but only through adoption. But it was sold to the US public as, see, it's the same thing. We're taking in needy, endangered children, right? But the political sort of sleight of hand that was played took advantage of the fact that many Americans at the time didn't really fully understand the difference between fostering and adopting, right? It was a distinction that for cultural and legal reasons didn't become hardened until the post-war era, because before the emergence of sort of child welfare laws and practices in the US in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, in many cases, when a child ended up without parents, they were informally fostered out to community members or informally adopted, right? The categories were blurry, right? Law around adoption didn't really become solidified until the post-war period. So taking advantage of this lack of clarity in the American public's mind about the difference between fostering and adopting, they changed the language so that from then on, refugee children would be taken in, but really they were adoptees. They weren't refugees, right? And what that meant is that satisfying the desire of white families for white European children, one political constituent teamed up with the restrictionist who wanted to make sure that that brief moment in which refugee children would be considered on their own right, the law changed, right? It's tricky to try and explain, but I would say, like, read that chapter in the book. To me, it's one of the most fascinating examples of sort of the way that politics can sell us something that sounds like it's a humanitarian thing, but in fact, its intention was entirely other. Yes, human trafficking. I am so sorry. I'm wondering if perhaps Francesca or Hedy might have some thoughts on this. I am not at all qualified to speak about human trafficking, and so I would hesitate to say anything on the topic. So there was a question about narratives around the human trafficking of children and how it might tie in with some of these. Narratives around the human trafficking of children tie into the historical analysis in the US.
Sorry.
Narratives are, it's okay for academics, by the way, to say, I need to think about it. or-
Yeah.
That's one of the good things about academics, that we don't have to provide these kind of. And it's
How-
also-
I think in the UK at the moment, there's a big debate about human trafficking, or alternatively termed modern slavery, which obviously ties into sort of very historical notions around slavery. And I just think it's just quite interesting how the terminology has been changing, heading towards human trafficking and modern slavery rather than refuge and sanctuary.
I mean, I guess the one thing that I might be qualified to say, and this is more of an observation than anything else, is that the category of trafficking is a very tricky one. It has a clear legal definition, But the way it's understood by people who are border crossers is very different, right? So, for example, the US southern border, which is now so heavily militarized and so heavily policed, you can't just walk across it in most places anymore, right? And even where the border is open, the conditions, the land, the weather, the sort of the geographic vastness of the spaces that we're talking about means that you can't just put on a backpack and walk across it alone, right? In most cases, people have guides, coyotes, right? They have guides who are paid that know which are the spaces where they can get across without being observed by the Border Patrol, but also that know the landscape. We're talking about mountains and deserts, people that are experts at crossing the terrain, right? So technically, anybody who's come across the border, in legal definitions in the US, has been trafficked, right? And children in particular, who questions of consent, in most cases, children that are sent across the border, their parents have consented, and not in any casual sort of way. Their parents are fully aware that it's dangerous, right? Think about the desperation of a parent who hands over their child to someone to cross the border, right? It's not callousness, it's desperation. But a child who has been handed over to someone who was paid to transport them, in most cases under US law, has been trafficked. That's not the way that most parents or children understand the experience that they've had, right? That ties in with an argument that I make in my epilogue about how sometimes what we know as scholars and what we might argue as scholars can sometimes clash up against what we might argue as advocates or as political actors, right? Much of the narrative around child migrants in the US, and it ties into notions of deservingness, really attempts to trigger cultural and emotional norms around childhood as innocent and helpless, right? So we tend to represent folks that are children's rights advocates, tend to represent unaccompanied minors as young, right? Even if you look at the book cover of my book, right? The child on the cover is clearly 8 or 9 years old, maybe. That was not a decision that I made. It was a decision that my press made, right? Because it's the image that most people have of what an unaccompanied minor looks like. They're represented by advocates as young, as helpless, because this is supposed to provoke sympathy, right? And perhaps make people favorable to their admission, as victims, right? And this, of course, ties in with this notion of trafficking, right? Someone who has been trafficked is a victim, right? The reality is, in the US at least, most unaccompanied minors are over the age of 15, and most are boys, right? And many of them in their home contexts would not consider themselves children. Many of them have been economically active, have been working full-time for several years, contribute to their family economy. Some of them may have children of their own, right? And as Hedy was saying earlier, right, the differences in who is a child is understood varies from location and moment and time to time, and is heavily racialized as well. Who gets to be a child under the sort of Western understanding of, dependent, passive, economically not productive, right? All of this to say that I suppose, yes, narratives around human trafficking of children really rest on a lot of assumptions about childhood as a particular experience, and also thinking about migration as a particular kind of experience, right?
I'll just add, it occurred to me as you were speaking to the person who asked that last question. There's a book that came out a couple of months ago by Elizabeth Faulkner, specifically about the history of child trafficking and how international legal norms evolved around that. So that's something that the person might be interested in, but also to support what you were saying. There are studies in relation to child migrants in Africa, where those children have been recorded as trafficked children,
Yes.
but they were actually asked in ethnographic studies, and they said, no, we just decided to move to earn a better living, to support our families, and so forth. Doesn't undermine the whole issue of trafficking, obviously, but it just shows you how the rhetoric around it is kind of structured in a particular family. If you want to ask
Yeah.
2 questions.
Say, mate. Got 2 questions for the lady here and the lady there. Right. I came here today as an ignorant person. Sorry if I mean less ignorant person. Regards to everything you said. I won't go through. I want to go back to this. You said the problem child. Do you know where the problem child is and where it's located then? Who is the problem child? I know you talk about one person. It's not your question. So I think we're all problem children, realistically. I think our ignorance is derived from our access to student parents. And I don't think that's been taught in Western schools, and that's the issue. In terms of slave master, we've been taught that, yeah, it was the white man and the white woman that's opening our backsides left, right, center, and that's what made us who we are. But why don't we talk about the Nigerian slave masters? Why are we not talking about that? There are a lot of ignorance going on in this world, and that's one thing I want to pick up because I'm not nothing to blaming. Because if you blame the government for a trap, but who's the real blame here? Who do we really blame? Our brothers, sisters, mum, dad? Or should we blame ourselves? Because we're not children forever. Look at your daughter, probably still innocent. But when she turns 18 and 21, that's when she gains her own cognition and starts becoming more mature. That's when she starts making her own stuff and decisions in life. The school's not there to be a friend or educator to and how we want to be educated, so it's time to be educated. Now, my question to you, who do you advocate for? Yourself for you? And who inspires you as well to write the story, the book?
We had another, thank you. We have another question here. And we can answer both, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm Ethne Nightingale. I've just written a book on child migrant voices in modern Britain.
What's the name again?
Child migrant voices.
Your name.
Ethne Nightingale.
Thank you.
So it's 1930s to the present day. So there are I saw lots of parallels, and particularly the issue of the Home Office or the issue of age, the issue of how children are dealt with when they arrive in a completely unchild sensitive way. And it's becoming increasingly difficult in the UK because of the recent legislation, but also the long delays. So children can't invest in the future. And so the actors in all this, which I was interested in, particularly there's the government, etc., but there's also the press and how that historically, whether you looked at that, because that seems to me quite a crucial way in demonizing child migrants, particularly.
And lifting them up, right? It sort of pre-selecting for the public certain groups of children to be concerned about. So yes, when I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that one of the things I realized while doing this study was how many different actors were so involved in the outcomes of particular groups being selected or denied admission. The press since the beginning was an incredibly important actor in each of the cases when children were accepted or denied, right? Fascinating, yes. Your comments made me think of something that, scholars of children spend a lot of time thinking about how do we grapple with the question of children's agency, their own ability to make choices, their own responsibilities, right? And, I think any scholar who deals with a marginalized population that have been in one way or the other excluded or differentially treated under the law has to grapple with the question of agency. Because on the one hand, we have to acknowledge that political, economic, social structures do make possible certain choices for some people while closing doors for other people. And yet at the same time, we can't be so overly deterministic that we erase individuals' own abilities to act and to think and to make strategic choices, right? Yeah, I don't think of my book or my scholarship as being about blaming. I think of it almost more as diagnosing, right? Like finding out what happened and who acted in which ways, right? But certainly not with the intention of ever taking away agency from individual children. And in fact, that's one of the things that I reflect upon in the epilogue, where my own role as a scholar and my concern to advocate for children come into tension with one another, right? Because as a scholar, I can tell you that not every child that has been admitted as an unaccompanied refugee minor came in as an innocent victim, right? There were cases of children who did come seeking economic advantage or a better future, people that we would call mixed migrants rather than refugees per se, right? There were also children in all of these different groups who became problem children, right? Who got involved with juvenile delinquency, who smoked and drank and crashed cars and joined gangs and so on. They certainly weren't the majority, but speaking to the agency, right? Children are making their own choices, right? So, you know, my hope is always to try and preserve the fact that there is room for individual agency, right? With that being said, laws and policies and social structures and access to resources shape how much choice different children have, right?
I mean, yeah, but it doesn't negate the fact that we are all ignorant, we're still making financial income of people's slavery.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
Yes.
that's one thing people are being. Actually, no, we've been taught about that slightly in school. We're not tiring.
Yeah.
The school that's a bullshit sometimes.
Yeah. No, our schools need to do, and I can't speak to your schools, but I can speak to American schools, right? Our public schools in the US, which is the opposite here. I don't quite know how it works, but our schools need to do a much better job of teaching history in a more sort of open and critical way, right? Not for the purpose of blaming, but so that we can understand the origins of the social problems that we have now in order to maybe make them better, right?
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for, but we're staying here. If anyone has questions or comments, we're happy to discuss further. Let me join me in thanking our speakers again, Anita and Francesca.